It is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for this conference on harmonizing religious liberties with cultural traditions and values. Speaking to the topic of religious liberty and religion's resurgence will be Professor Samuel P. Huntington. Professor Huntington is the Albert J. Weatherhead III Professor at Harvard University. He received his BA degree from Yale, his MA from the University of Chicago, and his PhD from Harvard University. He has taught at Columbia and Harvard universities. He served as chairman of the Harvard Department of Government, as well as director of Harvard's Center for International Affairs, and presently serves as director of the John M. Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. Professor Huntington has had a distinguished career. He has been a research associate of the Brookings Institution, a faculty fellow of the Social Sciences Research Council, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Studies of the Behavioral Sciences, a Visiting Fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, and Senior Research Associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, London. Professor Huntington was elected President of the American Political Science Association, has served as Coordinator of Security Planning for the National Security Council in the White House, and was a founder and co-editor of the quarterly journal Foreign Affairs. He is the author or editor of over a dozen books and over 90 scholarly articles. His latest book, The Clash of Civilization and the Remaking of World Order, was published last fall and is being translated into 18 other languages. It is an honor to welcome to Brigham Young University and this important conference, Professor Samuel P. Huntington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to congratulate Carl Durham and the other people responsible for organizing this conference, because it deals, I think, with one of the most important topics that exists in the world today. And it is a topic which I believe is of rising importance. Indeed, I have felt some of that myself. Up until 3 months ago, nobody ever asked me to talk about the question of religious liberty. During the past 3 months, I've had half a dozen invitations to talk about religious liberty. This, however, let me both tell you and warn you, is the first talk I'm giving on that subject. And it will have all the immaturity of a first expression of ideas. What I would like to do is to pose, comment on, but not really answer 4 questions. First, what do we mean when we speak of freedom of religion and religious liberties? Second, what is the state of religious liberty in today's world? Are religious liberties expanding or contracting? Third, what are the principal forces shaping the place of religious liberties in today's world? And then finally, what steps, if any, can or should be taken to promote religious liberties at the present time? First of all, what do we mean when we talk about religious liberties? Obviously, this term can cover many things. Perhaps, however, it might be useful to think of it in terms of different dimensions. There is the dimension of the individual believer, the dimension of the religious activist, and then the dimension of the religious organization. At the level of the individual believer, it seems to me that freedom of religion means freedom to hold religious beliefs of the person's choice, to participate in religious services and other religious activities, to engage indeed in religious practices generally, insofar as these do not infringe on the rights of others or violate generally accepted norms of civilized behavior. And perhaps very centrally, the right to join a religion and to abandon a religion as one's conscience dictates. Secondly, for the religious activist, and by that I mean a person who devotes a large part of his or her daily life to religion, a priest, minister, rabbi, imam, monk, the freedom for the religious activist presumably means freedom to promote his religion, to conduct services, organize religious groups, counsel members of his religion, provide education in religious affairs, and perhaps most importantly, freedom to proselytize and attempt to win converts to his religion. Thirdly, at the organizational level, freedom of religion presumably involves the freedom to form religious groupings, churches, related organizations, to structure those groups internally as its leaders see fit, to raise money, issue publications, maintain relationships with other religious organizations, including foreign religious organizations, and to be as free of state control and regulation as other groups in the society. At all three levels, it seems to me, freedom of religion involves freedom from discrimination and harassment on religious grounds. On the other hand, it does not seem to me that it is a violation of religious freedom for a government to use public funds to support one religion and not others, and to give tax exemptions to some religions but not others. Also, it seems to me it is the responsibility of government to ensure that religious organizations do not infringe on the rights of non-members or on the rights of their own members. Obviously, when we talk about religious freedoms and the interaction between the religious organizations and people who are committed to religion on the one hand and political authorities on the other, there are all sorts of gray areas, which I won't attempt to get into, but whether or not people should, for instance, be exempted from conscription on religious grounds and what form that exemption should take, it seems to me, is one of those gray areas. Now, I probably have missed many aspects of religious liberty in this very quick itemization, and I've probably misstated some, but the factors I've mentioned do seem to me to be some of the core elements we might associate with that term. Okay, secondly, what is the state of religious liberties today? Are they expanding or contracting? What are the threats and opportunities that exist with respect to religious liberty? Now, obviously, this is a very broad topic. It is very difficult to make any generalizations. If one looks at threats to religious liberties around the world, however, it seems to me the most obvious threats tend to come from three sources. One, there are extremist and violent groups, which are often religious groups, who engage in violence against members of other religions. Such violent extremist groups, however, usually use violence quite indiscriminately. You may remember that there was much outrage a few years ago over the killing of 7 Trappist monks in Algeria by an Islamic extremist group And that was counted as a attack on them because of their religion, and perhaps it was. But that same Islamic extremist group had killed thousands of Muslims during the same period of time. But anyway, that is one source of threat to religious freedom. A second source comes on occasion, as we have seen in this country and quite often elsewhere, by mob action. Popular hatred of a particular group which is viewed as totally alien or outcast or evil for one reason or another. And this often occurs in various societies. We've seen attacks in Indonesia on Chinese Christians. We had the Hindu mob destroying a mosque in India a few years ago, and many other such events could be cited. But thirdly, and most importantly, it seems to me, restrictions on religious liberties come not from extremist terrorist groups or from angry mobs. They come from governments. Governments surely are responsible for over 90% of the restrictions on religious liberties. As one looks around the world, one can see that these restrictions exist in almost all societies. And obviously, they include, at times, in some societies, the prohibition of any religious practices by any religion. Or they may include, as in some Muslim societies, such as perhaps Saudi Arabia, the prohibition of the practice of all religions except one religion. In many societies, state control and regulation of religious organizations is widespread. Only those sponsored by the state or registered with the state may be able to exist, and such approval may often be denied. In many societies, there are prohibitions or drastic restrictions on contacts with foreign religious organizations, the receipt of foreign support, the prohibitions on foreign missionaries coming into the country, prohibition on the circulation of publications from abroad. There are also, of course, restrictions on the size, number, activities, independence of religious organizations. There are efforts to control and dictate what goes on in religious education. There are, in some countries, the persecution of religious activists, their imprisonment and torture. There are, in many countries, restrictions on proselytizing. And there are, certainly in many Muslim countries, prohibitions on a Muslim abandoning Islam for another religion, an action which in some Muslim countries is punishable by death. Well, what can one say about the extent and trends in these restrictions on religious liberties? As I said, some restrictions, it seems to me, are found in all cultures. Most of these restrictions are found in a few cultures. These restrictions are often imposed on what are viewed as non-mainstream or non-traditional religious bodies, more than they are on those which are considered more mainstream. This means that the religious groups that suffer are those which are pursued as sects, Jehovah's Witnesses, evangelical Protestants, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. These are the ones which are most likely to suffer restrictions. Restrictions are, I believe, particularly pervasive in Muslim countries against both Muslims and against Muslim fundamentalists. They also, obviously, are very pervasive in China and a few other Asian countries. And I must say that in looking over the program for this conference, I was struck by the fact that later this afternoon there will be regional panels dealing with Europe, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Russia, and other countries in the former Soviet Union. But I did not detect any panel on either Islam or China. And it seems to me that it is with those societies that the greatest problems with respect to religious liberties exist. Well, is religious liberty increasing or decreasing? It's hard to say, I think. As you may know, in July, the State Department issued a report entitled U.S. Policies in Support of Religious Freedom, Focus on Christians. That was a report which it produced as a result of prodding from Congress. The report includes an annex which tries to summarize the state of religious freedom and persecution in about 70 countries or so. It doesn't give much sense, however, as to whether religious persecution is increasing or decreasing. And I think it would be very useful if somebody, if it hasn't already been done, it would be very useful if somebody or some organization could take the lead in trying to develop over time annual surveys of the state of religious liberties in the world. One organization which I'm associated with, Freedom House, does put out every year a general evaluation of the state of freedom in the world and rates countries in terms of their political and civil freedoms, but it does not focus primarily upon religious liberty, and it seems to me that is something which is probably needed, and unless it exists and I don't know about it. One would think that with the spread of democracy around the world in the past several decades, with the increase in the number of democratic countries in the world by over 40 or more since 1974, that very probably religious liberties have increased. And that may be the case. There is, however, it seems to me, a lot of contrary evidence. And some of this may go to the point that Dr. Larry Diamond made last year in a very important article in the Journal of Democracy, where he drew the distinction between electoral democracies and liberal democracies. And he pointed out that the number of electoral democracies in the world had increased greatly and was up at something like 117 countries where you had governments that had been produced by some form of reasonably fair and open election. A much smaller number, if I remember correctly, I think it was 79, he classified as liberal democracies, which would be electoral democracies where there was a recognition for human rights, the rule of law, personal liberties, and so forth, restrictions on police brutality and the like. And so we have a fair number of electoral democracies in the world which are not liberal democracies, and I suspect that the state of religious freedom in those democracies, which are electoral democracies but not liberal democracies, leaves something to be desired. In addition, we have, I think, seen certainly trend in China towards increasing restrictions and harassment and persecution of religious minorities, Christian, Buddhist, and Muslim, particularly with respect to the persecution of Christians. There seems to have been, since 1989, a mounting campaign, off again, on again, but always coming on strong by the Chinese authorities to harass and to persecute the Christian movements in China. These are, I think it is fair to say, a result exactly of what happened in 1989 in Eastern Europe, and the Chinese believe that the churches played a major role in bringing down communism in Eastern Europe at that time, and they have made it clear they don't intend to allow Christian churches to develop and do the same sort of thing in China. In addition, there is at least some evidence that intolerance in Muslim countries is increasing, and there may be some evidence that intolerance in some Christian countries is increasing. So while it is very hard to do any exact assessment, it seems to me very probably the trend in the world at the present time are not exactly favorable to religious liberties. Certainly also in this country, concern about religious liberty has greatly increased, particularly the concern about the persecution of Christians abroad. We've had a recent publication of 2 books that deal with this subject, Nina Shea's In the Lion's Den and Paul Marshall's Their Blood Cries Out. And there is increasing concern by a rather unusual alliance of very conservative people on the one hand and quite liberal people on the other around this issue. And we have denunciations of the mounting persecution of Christians around the world. And all of this is giving rise to increased interest in Congress on the part of a variety of people, and possibly congressional action to try to do something about this, a point I'll come back to in just a moment. In any event, if as I suspect is the case, there are increasing threats and problems for religious liberties around the world, the question then becomes, why is this happening? What is the reason why religious liberties seem to be in greater and greater question in so many societies? I believe that the central cause is indeed the worldwide resurgence of religion, which has occurred in the past 2 decades. This, it seems to me, is a global phenomenon of tremendous importance. In almost any society where you look, religious bodies and religious thinking is playing a more and more active and central role. We have, again, citing book titles, titles such as The Revenge of God, The Questioning of the Secular State, Secularism in Retreat, and similar titles, all of which are evidence of the increasing revival of religion. Why is this happening? I think it is because secular faiths and ideologies and creeds have been seen to not meet people's needs, particularly people in developing countries, rapidly modernizing countries need sources of moral guidance and help and of emotional, psychological, and otherwise, and churches increasingly are moving in and playing that role. Indeed, we saw one quite impressive manifestation of this in what happened in Washington this past weekend. And what happened there, it seems to me, is going on in the Muslim world and in India and in a variety of other places involving a variety of different religions. Well, if religion is becoming more important to people, then it is also acquiring some political dimension too. And in some measure, as a result of the rising importance of religion, it seems to me we are witnessing the politicization of religion. And governments are recognizing that, given the importance of religion, they have to either suppress it, control it, or use it. And they have pursued all of these strategies, and sometimes the same government will pursue all three of those strategies with respect to the same religion. But because of the increasing importance of religion in people's lives, governments have to now pay attention to it in one way or another. And in this sense, perhaps one could say that freedom of religion is becoming a victim of the power of religion and its importance in people's lives. And the basic source of this, it seems to me, in large part, goes back to the extent to which people are seeking some form of identity. I began collecting a few years ago newspaper and journal articles on different countries and have quite a large stack at home in my office, each of them about a different country, people of a different country: Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, India, Japan, Turkey, Mexico, Australia, Pakistan, the United States, many others. Each of these articles argues that the country it is concerned with, the people in it, are facing a major crisis of identity. The world seems to be in the midst of a global identity crisis, and everywhere people and nations are attempting to answer the most basic question humans can face: who are we? And I think they are answering that question in the traditional way human beings have answered it, by reference to the things that mean most to them. People define themselves in terms of ancestry and language and history, values, customs, culture, and most particularly religion. And religion is coming to play the central role in people's identity in a way in which it has not done previously, I believe, in this century. The rising importance of religion, I think, poses two distinct challenges for political leaders. The first can be a challenge to their political authority. In Muslim countries, quite obviously, fundamentalists challenge rulers for not governing according to the Quran and the Sharia, while rulers in Muslim countries, no matter how secular they may have been in the past, attempt to bolster their legitimacy by invoking religious symbols, supporting religious education, going on their pilgrimages to Mecca. Given the general absence of any form of electoral or democratic legitimacy in many Muslim countries, they have every reason, the rulers have, to seek the sanction of religion. And they are certainly attempting to do that at the same time as they try to suppress and eliminate religious extremists in their own societies. In China, in other Asian societies, and in many Muslim countries, Christianity is also seen as a threat to political authority. Religion was of central importance in this great wave of democratization that began in the mid-1970s. The Catholic Church played a crucial role in bringing democracy to Latin American countries and the Philippines. Protestants and Catholics were active in bringing democracy to Korea and Taiwan. Indeed, I doubt that the movement of Korea towards democracy would have occurred if in the previous decades something like 30% of the Korean population hadn't been converted to Christianity. And in Korea, the Catholic and Presbyterian leaders played a significant role in encouraging the movement to democracy. And the leading dissident political leaders supporting democracy also were Christian. On Taiwan, President Lee Teng-hui, a devout Presbyterian, led his country to democracy. Hence, I think it is understandable why communist authorities in China and elsewhere view the spread of Christianity as a threat to their political authority, and why they regularly take steps to curtail and prevent the spread of Christianity. And this is, I think, is true generally, that Christianity, in terms of its very inherent nature, is a destabilizing force in authoritarian countries. And I must say, one can only wonder what led Fidel Castro to invite a papal visit this coming year. It could have been either a moment of absent-mindedness or an indication of supreme self-confidence. But I can think of few things which would be more challenging, or likely to be more challenging to Castro's rule in Cuba than a papal visit. It is far more likely to shake his authority than anything that is produced by the CIA or by the exiles in Miami or by economic sanctions. Well, religion is restricted or suppressed then because in some circumstances it challenges political authority. It also, however, may challenge the identity of societies, getting back to this basic question of identity. The rise of religion, the revival of religion, has led, in some cases, to a redefinition of the state and the basis of authority within a country from secular models that were the product of Western political ideologies. Just look back to what has happened to the creations of four major state creators in the first part of this century. Lenin embraced and revised Marxism to create a secular communist state in Russia. Ataturk in Turkey formulated an ideology, Kemalism, which was statist and nationalist and highly secular, and which attempted to eliminate religion from playing any significant role in life in Turkey. Nehru embraced the idea of a democratic, socialist, secular state in India. Ben-Gurion formulated a version of Zionism as the basis for a secular Jewish state in Israel. Now, all four of those models of Lenin, Ataturk, Nehru, and Ben-Gurion are under a challenge, or have been under challenge in their societies, with communism having collapsed in Russia and the religious identity again playing a significant role, with the rise of Turkish fundamentalism in Turkey, challenging the Ataturk legacy, with the development of Hindu fundamentalists backing what is the largest party in India and arguing that India should be a Hindu country, and with the activities of the Orthodox Jews in Israel challenging very vigorously Ben-Gurion's definition of Israel. So increasingly, it seems to me, religion is becoming a basis for defining communities and defining national communities. And of course, one can see this at work in the most traumatic and horrible terms in what happened in the case of the former Yugoslavia. Well, finally, what can be done to promote or protect religious liberties? The report from the State Department that I mentioned earlier lists a variety of things which it argues the United States government is doing. I must, in order to do this, I must say I'm not overwhelmingly impressed with their list. The government has formed an advisory committee on religious freedom. That's to be expected. It has told its embassies to report more frequently on on the state of religion in the countries they're accredited to. It is said that it will give more attention to religious questions in the human rights reports it issues on countries each year. It says that it is urging the radio broadcasting, the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, to pay more attention to religion. It is raising the issues of religion in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and it is attempting to do something which should have happened a long while ago, which is facilitating the granting of asylum here to religious refugees. I don't mean to play down these activities. They are obviously well-intentioned and may have some effect, but I don't consider them of any tremendous significance. The concern in Congress over the somewhat lackadaisical attitude of the executive branch towards questions of religious liberty has led to what I mentioned earlier, the introduction of legislation on the subject, as you probably know, under the sponsorship of Representative Frank Wolf and Senator Arlen Specter. And their legislation would create an Office of Religious Persecution Monitoring in the White House with a director appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. And it would be the function of this office to identify those governments engaged in religious persecution, and when it identified those governments, these governments would automatically be subject to a variety of economic sanctions, including restrictions, elimination of non-humanitarian foreign aid. This bill has been endorsed by the majority leader in the Senate and by the Speaker of the House. I don't know if it will get through Congress. I think it is hard to consider this a really serious way of attempting to deal with the problems of religious liberties around the world, and it obviously is a bill which, if it did become law, would create tremendous embarrassment and difficulties for the executive branch in attempting to implement it, or in attempting to avoid implementing it, which would probably be the responsible thing for the executive branch to do. But anyway, is there anything else that might be of greater importance here or greater significance in terms of promoting religious liberties? Well, if my argument that restrictions on religious liberties are a product of the growing importance of religion, one thing, of course, would be to try to reduce the importance of religion. That may happen over time, and societies do go through periods of greater religious concern and fervor, and then it eases. But that is something which it is very difficult to do in any focused and conscious way. It is a trend of history in one direction or another. And in the absence of any reduction in the significance of religion, I don't think efforts by the U.S. government or any other governments are really going to greatly affect the condition of religious liberties around the world. Instead, it seems to me that the way to promote religious liberties is to promote liberty in general. Religious liberties are a part of human freedom generally, and the liberties we like to associate with our way of life. And hence, the promotion of liberties in general, the promotion of liberal democracy will benefit religious liberties. Well, how does one do that? As I indicated, one way could be to promote the expansion of Christianity in the world. There is a very strong correlation between Western Christianity and freedom in the world. In fact, 85 or 90% of the free countries in the world are Catholic or Protestant. And Western Christianity, it seems to me, provides a basis for liberty that most other religions lack. Now, we all know that in what I have called the clash of civilizations, the West has immense and obvious political, economic, and military resources. It also, however, it seems to me, has in Christianity an immense and not so obvious religious resource, which it can use and which people in the West should use to attempt to spread liberty around the world, particularly in those Asian and Muslim societies where it is lacking so greatly. Let me conclude these remarks by quoting myself. In my book on the clash of civilizations, I say that in modernizing non-Western societies, the most successful protagonists of Western culture are not neoclassical economists or crusading Democrats or the executives of multinational corporations. They are, and most likely will continue to be, Christian missionaries. Neither Adam Smith nor Thomas Jefferson will meet the psychological, emotional, moral, and social needs of urban migrants and first-generation secondary school graduates in these modernizing societies. Jesus Christ may not meet them either, but he is likely to have a better chance. Thank you.
Professor Huntington has indicated he'll be happy to take questions. I'll let him call on you. Would you just stand and speak loudly?
Well, why don't you recognize people? Okay?
All right.
Because otherwise...
I'll recognize people. Questions? All right, and I'm supposed to repeat the questions for the translators. Questions for Professor Huntington? Yes, Doug.
Professor Huntington, is it possible that some of the examples that you might consider, I'm thinking of so-called religious crisis in Northern Ireland, or in Bosnia, or in Russia, that it's a little more complex in the way in which organized religion is tied to nationalism. That is, that there may be a great deal more religion and Christianity on the surface, and a good deal more nationalism below, sort of iceberg line.
Supposed to restate the question.
Okay.
An example like Northern Ireland, does that pose problems for Professor Huntington's description, especially since what you may see on the surface may not be what is really going on beneath the surface?
Well, I would feel happier referring to some of the other examples you gave than to Northern Ireland, which seems to me to be a legacy of something which should have disappeared centuries ago in the Western world. But I think there is an important question here as to how people do form identities, and I don't know quite how the Northern Irish religious identities became so deeply ingrained. But we can see the process at work in contemporary cases, particularly in the former Yugoslavia, where, as far as I can see, down until the end of the 1980s, religious identity was really not all that significant, particularly among the Muslims. Now it began to become more significant during the 1980s when there was a great concern developed in Serbia about the alleged persecution of Serbs in Kosovo, the Albanian part of the former Yugoslavia. And Milosevic, in appealing to and rousing Serbian nationalism, made a great deal of that. But he wasn't alone. All sorts of Serbian intellectuals, liberal people, and so forth, also saw that what they thought was religious persecution of Serbs as a reason to rally around the cause of Serbian nationalism. And once that process got started, of course, there's an action-reaction phenomenon that takes place. Everybody says that the Muslims in Bosnia were historically very casual in their Islam. But as they got drawn into this conflict, their identification with Islam, their religious passion increased. And the wars, the fighting that became more and more defined in religious terms. And of course, you had Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, even Malaysia, rallying behind the Bosnian Muslims and helping them because they identified with their co-religionists. And so, however it started, the fighting there did become in some sense, a religious conflict, and the nationalisms were defined in religious terms. And because after all, these are people who basically spoke the same language and were basically of the same ethnicity and so forth and so on, the Serbs and Muslims. The one thing that distinguished them was religion. And I think one sees that again and again, that religion is something that political leaders and people turn to in order to both reinforce their beliefs and their world perspective, but also to broaden it. After all, Saddam Hussein had absolutely no use for religion until he got into the Gulf War. And then he discovered that this was the one thing he could appeal to in order to try to get support from other Muslim countries. And it's because of both the intensity with which religious beliefs are often held, but also the breadth of religious communities that the religion comes to play this role and becomes so central to people's identities. Now, this won't necessarily last indefinitely, but it seems to me that is the trend of things at the present time.
Professor Johnson.
Mr. Huntington, many of us have admired the way that you've gotten into this newer subject for you. I'm curious, I think like many people, so many of us have worked on a nation state, and it's been the basis for understanding international politics, and yet you've led a movement into a different direction. How did you have to write that seminal article, and how did you have to shift your attention in this direction?
Well,
restate the question. Translate.
Okay. The question was, how did I come to write what was described as my seminal article? A seminal article. Okay. Referring, I assume, to the article on the Clash of Civilizations, which is now a 350-page book. Well, the basic argument in both the article and the book is the importance of culture in world affairs. And as I studied the problems of political and economic development in the world, it seemed to me, and why did some countries develop economically or politically and others did not? And you could look at all the arguments of the economists about the right policies and doing this and doing that and so forth and so on, but it seemed to me that left an awful lot unexplained. And I became more and more convinced that one one reason why, say, South Korea developed the way it did over the course of several decades, whereas Ghana, which in 1960 had exactly the same economic profile as South Korea, didn't. Eventually, you had to go back to some sort of a cultural explanation. And you could look at foreign aid and this, that, and the other thing, but they didn't tell the whole story. And it seemed to me that countries did sort of divide up culturally, and hence when the Cold War came to an end, the Soviet Union collapsed, I began looking at what seemed to be happening in the world, and it seemed to me that culture was going to be the factor that was going to play the central role in the new alliances and antagonisms that would exist between countries in the post-Cold War world.
The very back. Loudly, please.
Is it your contention then that this growing trend towards spiritualization or religious renewal is based in pragmatism, or either at the absence of economic prosperity, the absence of social justice, whatever the case may be? Is it based in pragmatism, or is there another explanation based on your findings?
Again, briefly restate. Is the move towards greater religion a result of pragmatism or some other cause?
You do a good job of summarizing questions. Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by pragmatism, but it seems to me that the revival of religion around the world is closely linked to the processes of social and economic modernization that are occurring, to the processes of global integration that are occurring. And these lead people, particularly in what we used to refer to as the third world, to try to move into cities, to try to join the modern portions of the economy in their countries, to leave behind their traditional way of life in the village. And they turn to religion, as it seems to me, as meeting very, very real needs. And if one looks at what studies have been done of who are the most active participants in the Muslim fundamentalist movements, in Hindu fundamentalist movements, who are the South Koreans that left Buddhism to become Catholics or Presbyterians, who are the Latin Americans who are leaving Catholicism to join evangelical Protestant groups. They have astonishingly similar profiles. They are people who are caught up in this process of change, and for one reason or another, the traditional religions, the traditional ties and morality of the village and so forth didn't meet their needs, and religious organizations moved in and did. Also, I might say, the governments didn't meet their needs. This is clearly true in Muslim countries where governments were totally blind to what had to be done to help the immense masses that were coming into the cities in their societies. And Muslim fundamentalist organizations saw that there was a need for social welfare and guidance and spiritual help and moral guidance and education and healthcare and so forth and so on, and they provided that. And in this way, it seems to me, religious organizations from very different religions are playing central roles in easing along this process of transition we're in.
I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the question restater to ask one myself. Professor Huntington, during your presentation, you talked about religion needing to be free of state control as much as other groups in society. That raised the question in my mind, at least in some societies, religion is more free of state control. That is to say, there's a presumption that the state should have as much as possible a hands-off position with respect to regulation of religion. Are you articulating a different standard?
Not consciously. And when you say that in some societies religion is more free of state control than other types of social activities, it's hard for me to think of more than one society where that's true, and that's this one.
That's the one I was thinking of.
Well, all right. The United States is always the exception.
Other questions? Yes.
Professor Huntington, you seem to feel great pessimism for the efforts of the United States government to prevent religious intolerance, and at the same time you also said that Christian societies are much more likely to tolerate. Do you then see no solution without changing these societies that are fundamentally religious?
Restate the question. The juxtaposition between the government's seeming inability, according to Professor Huntington, can't think of the question in your name at the same time, sorry. Your cynicism or skepticism about government's inability to act in contrast to the force you see that religion may bring.
Well, I think it is very difficult for a government such as ours, which has a whole variety of needs and pressures which it has to respond to take effectively the sorts of actions that might be necessary in order to promote religious freedom in societies where it is lacking. First of all, governments can't, if they act alone, they're going to be pretty isolated. And I don't know how many other governments we could have, to join with us in attempting to do this. We certainly could do better than we have, because, and I think it's rather scandalous the extent to which European governments and the U.S. government have allowed the Chinese government to play one off against the other on questions of human rights. When we bring pressure on China about human rights, the Chinese, of course, say, well, that's very interesting. We're going to have to reconsider that contract with Boeing and maybe give it to Airbus. And they do the same thing in reverse with the Europeans. But again, it's very difficult for governments to cooperate on this, and all governments will have other legitimate concerns, including promoting economic interests and jobs in their society, and you can't get away from that, or they'll have security concerns. And that is the reason why it seems to me that there is only a very limited role for effective action by government. Private organizations are something else, and it seems to me it is very important, indicated, to try to promote religious freedom abroad, and I think promoting the spread of Christianity in a society like China is one way of doing that. And private organizations, churches, other groups can attempt to do that in ways in which governments cannot.
Yes. Who makes the rules in tensions between religion and government?
Well, basically governments make the rules because they have the power and the coercive force, if necessary, to impose the rules. I think there clearly is some sort of an arena or area in which religious organizations can act. As our chairman suggested, it's broader in this country than in any other country I can think of. But in the end, it's going to be governments which are going to be decisive. And governments are, as I said, will use religion to bolster their legitimacy, or they will attempt to restrict religious activity, or they may attempt to suppress religious activity which which they think threatens their legitimacy. And so in the end, it's going to be within the control of governments. If, however, societies can change, and they are changing, and the religious beliefs existing in a society can develop or be altered, that will affect the behavior of governments, because governments operate, obviously, in a social and cultural environment.
You'll be next, but while you're standing up, let me just make sure that all conference participants, those with the name tags, have also had a chance to ask questions. So we'll turn just to you in a moment. Your question.
Mr. Huntington, suppose the audience were full of leading Muslims today, and they had a concern with liberty within their own cultures. Would you have made the clarion call at the end to have them open their countries to Christian proselytizing?
Should Muslims be open to Christian proselytizing?
Yes, and vice versa. I think there is a serious question here, because obviously in most Muslim societies, the strongest opposition to the usually dictatorial regimes in power come from the Muslim fundamentalists. They pretty much monopolize opposition to established governments in the Muslim world. And we do face then the question of if you do have, if one of these movements does come to power, what is likely to be the consequences? I think the wise course would be to accept Muslim fundamentalist movements which come to power through the electoral process. That did not happen in Algeria. The Algerian military, of course, canceled an election that the fundamentalist organization, the FIS, was going to win with French backing and with American government acquiescence. That happened. I think that was a mistake. I think it also was most unfortunate that the Turkish military forced out of power in Turkey this spring the Welfare Party, which had gained power through a fair electoral process and through negotiating a deal in the best democratic manner with another political party. But the military forced them out. I don't think it's helping either religion or religious freedom or democracy when that sort of thing happens. And I think one has to draw a distinction between a fundamentalist organization which comes to power through elections and a fundamentalist organization which comes to power through either a revolution, as in Iran, or a coup d'etat, as in Sudan. Because there you may have, and you have had, some very different dynamics at work. And when movements come to power by force and violence, they usually tend to rule by force and violence. Movements which come to power by elections may turn to force and violence, but they're much less likely to.
Okay. Conference participants now, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Huntington, as you know, the local leadership in Chechnya has recently introduced Muslim Sharia laws as an obligatory legislation for all of this we have from Russia. Some people say that Russia or the United States or the international community should interfere in order to reinstall the norms of the Russian Constitution and the international religious freedom standards. But that can cause another war. So the question is, where would you place the division line between these situations, when it is better for the international community to interfere, and these situations when it is better to stay aside to prevent the clash of civilizations?
I think the example was Chechnya, is that right? Yeah. And Chechnya. Okay, I'll work on pronunciation. And when should the international community interfere, especially when the risk of violence is real, a war, a clash of civilizations?
Well, I think it is necessary for the international community, whatever that means, to be aware of its limitations. And when we talk about the international community, I guess we mean normally the great powers. In the case of Chechnya, it'd be Russia with possibly the Western powers, the United States, others involved. In most circumstances, it's the United States and some other powers, usually trying to act with the legitimacy of a UN approval. But I think there's, as an example after example of interventions has shown since the end of the Cold War, there's great limitations upon what the international community can do, whether it intervenes in cases of genocide, as in Rwanda and the Congo, or in total breakdown of a society, as in Somalia, or in civil wars and intercommunal wars, as in the former Yugoslavia. And often the international community intervention will only make things worse, or, as I suspect is the case in Bosnia, it will simply postpone the inevitable. And that may bring some benefits, but we've now got ourselves in a position where we can't get out of Bosnia because we know what will happen. And we're not going to be able to change the way in which the people there view each other and their readiness to go back fighting each other. With respect to Chechnya, I think the Russian government has, in fact, if not in theory, recognized the independence of Chechnya, and hence I don't think the Russian government or any other government should intervene in Chechnya. And if the Chechen people want to adopt Muslim law and rules, I think it's incumbent upon the rest of us to accept that.
Other conference participants? Yes, please.
Professor, could you please share with us your thoughts about freedom of religion and indigenous peoples? I think that here in our country, we are propelled with religious endeavors to go to developing countries in Latin America, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, or Africa, in order to indoctrinate indigenous peoples. We do not respect their culture, tradition, or value system.
Question is religious freedom and indigenous peoples.
Well, I think that's a difficult issue because, as in the cases you cited in Africa or elsewhere, there is on the surface an apparently great imbalance of resources and capacities between those who come in from abroad with, usually, I think, with the best of intentions to try to improve the indigenous people in terms of welfare, economic well-being, health, and so forth and so on, and also, obviously, at times attempt to proselytize and convert them to Christianity or whatever. And it is often difficult for the indigenous peoples, because of their lower level of capabilities and development, to resist this. I think some sort of a balance has to be struck, but I wouldn't say that it is wrong for Christian missionaries to go into the societies of people who are at a relatively low level of social and economic development and try to help them in terms of their material well-being and education and health. And also, I don't think it is necessarily wrong for them to try to convert them to Christianity.
This will be the last question. Is there a last question? Yes, please.
cultural. In your opinion, has to accommodate the cultural traditions and the liberty of religion, or the liberty of religion has to be the main issue and to change, to sponsor the change in the cultural traditions. I'm thinking about, for instance, some cultural traditions in the role of the women, for instance, or the way if they can go to the church, if they can participate. And how is this possible to harmonize these traditions with
Question is the harmonization theme of the conference, Professor Huntington commenting on that, with religious liberty on the one hand and cultural traditions. How do you accomplish that harmony? What accommodations need to be met? And what is the role of women as an example in that? Which is worth more or greater importance? Which is more important, religious liberty or cultural traditions in this accommodation?
Well, it depends. I mean, obviously you've raised the central issue here, and there's no easy answer. And accommodation, by its very definition, implies a certain give and take and compromise on both sides. I think in some cases you may be able to possible to work out some sort of merger or synthesis of these conflicting values and cultures. In other cases, it may be that they will simply have to coexist side by side. It seems to me that liberty of religion, however, is such a profound value that it should be compatible in one way or another with most cultural traditions. And I recognize on issues like the role of women and other issues, it's maybe difficult to work out that accommodation. And all I can say is that has to be done on a case-by-case basis with people trying to understand the point of view of the other person.
Please join me in thanking Professor Huntington.